History hides some terrifying secrets. We are looking at a time when the government decided who could have children and who vanished. These rules were written in ink, but paid for in sorrow. Prepare yourself, because the truth about these laws is disturbing. What happened back then changed the world laws we follow today. 1. The law that stopped families from starting. We like to think that starting a family is a basic human right. You meet someone, you fall in love, and you decide to have kids. It is a personal choice that nobody else gets to make for you. But back in 1933, the government in Germany decided they had the right to choose who could be a parent and who could not. They passed a new rule called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. That is a long and fancy name, but the reality was terrifying. The government set up special courts. These were not courts for criminals who stole things. These were courts that decided if your genetics were good enough. If a doctor or a judge decided you had a condition they did not like, they could force you to have a surgery. This surgery made sure you could never have children. It sounds like a bad movie, but it was real life for over 400,000 people. They called it sterilization. The scary thing is that the list of conditions was very vague. It included things like blindness or deafness, but also things like feeble-mindedness. That meant if you did not do well on a test, they could take away your future family. Today, forcing a surgery like that on someone is a crime against humanity. It is totally illegal under international law. But back then, it was seen as a way to clean up society. Doctors who were supposed to heal people were the ones reporting them to the police. The trust between a patient and a doctor was completely broken. It went on for years, and the people who went through it carried the mental scars forever. But if you think the doctors were crossing the line with surgeries, wait until you hear what they were doing in the name of science. 2. Using people as lab rats. When you go to the hospital today, you have to sign a lot of papers. You have to agree to everything the doctor does. That is called consent, and it is a huge deal. But in the 1940s, the idea of consent did not exist for certain people. The government allowed scientists to use human beings for experiments that were not just painful, they were often fatal. They were obsessed with the military and wanted to know how to keep their pilots safe. So, they took prisoners and put them in chambers that simulated high altitudes. Imagine being in an airplane that shoots up to 68,000 feet in the air without a pressurized cabin. The air gets thin, and your lungs feel like they are going to burst. They did this to people just to see what would happen. They also wanted to know how to treat pilots who crashed in the freezing ocean. So, they took people and put them in tanks of ice water. The water was freezing cold, dropping their body temperature to dangerous levels. They watched and took notes while these people suffered from extreme hypothermia. It was cruel, and it had nothing to do with helping the patient. Today, the Nuremberg Code makes this totally illegal. You cannot test on humans without their permission, and you certainly cannot hurt them on purpose. But back then, these scientists were given medals and praise. They thought they were making progress, but they were really losing their humanity. And while these secret tests were happening behind closed walls, there was something else happening on every street corner that is now a major crime in Germany. 3. The symbol you see everywhere. If you walk down a street in Germany today, there is one thing you will never see. It is a symbol that represents hate and darkness. If someone paints it on a wall or waves a flag with it, they go to jail. That symbol is the swastika, but travel back to the 1930s, and it was literally everywhere. It was on the national flag. It was on government buildings. It was even on items you bought at the store. It became the law that this symbol had to be displayed. It was not a choice. If you did not show it, people got suspicious. It was a way of showing that you were part of the team, whether you wanted to be or not. They put it on stamps, on coins, and on uniforms. It was a visual takeover of the entire country. Now, strict laws in Germany and Austria ban this symbol completely. You can only see it if it is in a museum or a history movie. If you try to wear it on a shirt in Berlin today, the police will stop you immediately. It is considered a threat to the peace. The shift from it being mandatory to it being a crime shows how much the world has changed. Back then, it was a symbol of national pride for the regime. Now, it is a symbol of something we promised to never let happen again. But it was not just the flags that were mandatory. There was a specific way you had to say hello, and if you messed it up, you were in big trouble. 4. The mandatory greeting. We all have ways we say hello. Maybe a wave, a handshake, or just a nod. It is a casual thing. But under the regime, saying hello became a legal test of loyalty. You could not just say good morning. You had to use the Hitler salute. You had to raise your right arm and say those two famous words. This was not just for soldiers. This was for everyone. The mailman, the teacher, the person selling bread. If you walked into a room and did not do it, the room would go silent. People would stare. If you refused to do it, you could be reported to the secret police. It was a way of forcing everyone to agree with the government hundreds of times a day. Imagine being afraid to greet your neighbor because you might do it wrong. There are stories of people trying to avoid each other just so they did not have to perform the salute. Today, doing that gesture in Germany can get you up to 3 years in prison. It is considered a serious crime because it honors a criminal regime. It is wild to think that a simple arm movement went from being the law of the land to being a ticket to jail. It shows how the government wanted to control every tiny part of your life. They wanted to control your words, your movements, and as we are about to see, they even wanted to control who you could fall in love with. 5. Laws about who you could marry. Love is supposed to be blind, right? You fall for who you fall for. But in 1935, the government decided that love needed rules. They passed the Nuremberg Laws. These laws were obsessed with blood and heritage. They said that if you were considered a true German, you were not allowed to marry someone who was Jewish. It went even further than marriage. It made any romantic relationship between these groups illegal. They called it the law for the protection of German blood. If a couple was found breaking this law, they could be dragged through the streets or thrown in prison. It did not matter if they had been together for years. It did not matter if they were happy. The state broke families apart overnight. They had charts and graphs to measure how much German blood you had. It was a confusing and hateful system. Today, the right to marry who you want is protected by human rights laws all over the world. Discriminating against someone because of their background is illegal. But back then, the government checked your family tree before they let you get a marriage license. This law ruined countless lives and created a society full of fear. Neighbors would spy on neighbors to see who was visiting who. It turned love into a crime. And to make sure everyone went along with it, they used a massive machine that pumped out lies every single day. 6. The machine of lies. We talk a lot about fake news today. But imagine if the fake news was the only news. Imagine if the government owned every newspaper and every radio station. That is exactly what happened. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda took control of everything people read and heard. It was normal to see cartoons and articles that made fun of or demonized certain groups of people. There was a newspaper called Der Stürmer that was full of hateful lies. It was sold on every corner. Teachers used it in schools. It was legal and it was encouraged. The goal was to make people hate their neighbors so much that they would not care when bad things happened to them. Today, this kind of hate speech is illegal in many countries. You cannot publish things that incite violence or hatred against a group of people. In Germany specifically, denying that the Holocaust happened is a crime. But back then, lying to the public was the official government strategy. They knew that if they repeated a lie enough times, people would start to believe it. It was brainwashing on a national scale. It created an environment where terrible things could happen because people were told it was necessary. And one of the most terrible things involved the most vulnerable people in society. 7. Ending the lives of the sick. Hospitals are places where you go to get better. Doctors and nurses work hard to save lives. But there was a secret program called Action T4 that turned hospitals into dangerous places. The government decided that people with severe disabilities or mental illnesses were a burden on the country. They called them unworthy of life. This is one of the darkest chapters in history. The government set up centers where these patients were sent. The families were told their loved ones were going to a special clinic to get better care. But that was a lie. When the patients arrived, they were taken into rooms and their lives were ended. The families would get a letter later saying their relative passed away from a heart attack or pneumonia. It is estimated that 300,000 people lost their lives this way. It started with children and then expanded to adults. When people found out about it, there was some protest, so the government made the program more secret, but they did not stop. Today, involuntary euthanasia is illegal globally. Every life is considered valuable, and we have laws to protect people with disabilities. But back then, the government saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet. If the number did not add up, They removed the person. It was cold and calculated, and while they were removing people, they were also removing ideas. 8. Burning the books. You probably have a bookshelf at home or a library in your town. You can walk in and pick up any book you want. You can read about history, science, or politics, but in 1933, the government decided that some ideas were dangerous. They made lists of books that they did not like. This culminated in a massive event that happened all over the country. University students, is encouraged by the government, gathered thousands of books. They piled them up in public squares and set them on fire. We are talking about 25,000 books going up in flames in just one night in Berlin. They burned books by famous scientists like Albert Einstein. They burned books by American authors. Anything that disagreed with the Nazi way of thinking was turned to ash. It was a public statement that free thinking was over. They wanted to control not just what people did, but what they thought. Today, censorship like that is illegal in free societies. We have freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Burning books is seen as a sign of a weak and scared government. But back then, it was a celebration. Crowds cheered as the knowledge burned. It was the start of a time where only one voice was allowed to be heard. And for millions of people, that one voice ordered them into a life of hard labor. 9. Forced labor camps. Work is how we earn a living. You do a job, you get paid, you go home. But the regime built an entire economy on work that was not voluntary. They built concentration camps not just to hold people, but to use them. Millions of people were forced to work in factories, quarries, and farms without pay and without a choice. Big companies, some that still exist today, used this labor. The prisoners were treated like machines. They were given very little food and forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions. If they could not work anymore, they were considered useless. It was slavery in the modern age. This was perfectly legal under the laws of the Third Reich. The government had contracts with these companies. Today, forced labor is banned by the United Nations. We have strict labor laws that protect workers. Using slave labor is a serious crime. The scale of it was massive. It wasn't just a few people. It was an industrial system of exploitation. People were worked until they collapsed. It shows what happens when profits and power are put above human rights. And the first step to taking away a person's rights was taking away their citizenship. 10. Taking away citizenship. Being a citizen of a country means you belong. It means the laws protect you. You can vote, you can travel, and you have a passport. But in 1935, the government passed a law that stripped Jewish people of their citizenship. Overnight, they became subjects of the state with no rights. Imagine waking up and finding out you are no longer a citizen of the country you were born in. Your passport is worthless. You cannot vote. You cannot hold a government job. You are a stranger in your own home. This was a legal way to push people to the edges of society. Once they were not citizens, it was easier to pass more laws against them. They were legally defenseless. Today, international law says that you cannot strip someone of their citizenship based on their race or religion. It is a violation of basic rights. But the regime used this as a tool. It was a way to say these people are not one of us. It paved the way for all the terrible things that followed. And while they were taking away rights, they were also obsessing over symbols on their uniforms. 11. Wearing the skull uniforms are meant to show authority. Police officers wear badges. Firefighters wear emblems. But the elite guard of the regime, the SS, wore a symbol that was designed to cause fear. It was a silver skull and crossbones called the Totenkopf. It wasn't a pirate symbol. It was a badge that meant they were the most loyal and the most ruthless. Seeing that skull on a cap meant you were in serious danger. It was standard issue for the men who ran the camps and enforced the worst laws. Today, wearing that specific skull symbol or the jagged SS lightning bolts is a crime in Germany. They are classified as anti-constitutional symbols. If you display them, you get fined or arrested. The government takes it very seriously because they know what those symbols stood for. Back then, it was a mark of honor for them. They were proud to wear it. It shows how twisted the values were. A symbol of death was worn with pride. Now, we recognize it for what it is, a mark of hate. But the indoctrination didn't start with adults in uniforms. It started much, much earlier. 12. Cruelty in the classroom. School is supposed to be a safe place to learn. Teachers are there to help kids grow. But in the 1930s, schools became training grounds for the regime, and the discipline was brutal. Corporal punishment, which means hitting students, was encouraged, but not for the reasons you might think. They weren't just punishing kids for being late or talking in class. They were punishing kids to make them tough. They wanted to raise a generation of soldiers who did not feel pain and did not show mercy. If a student showed weakness, they were humiliated, and it got worse. Teachers would single out Jewish students and humiliate them in front of the class. They would bring them to the front of the room and use them as examples of what was wrong with the country. It was psychological and physical abuse that was state-sanctioned. Today, corporal punishment is banned in schools in most of Europe and many other parts of the world. Humiliating students based on their race is a hate crime. We know that kids need support, not fear, but the regime wanted soldiers, not students. And once school was out, the training continued. 13. Forcing kids to join. Most kids have hobbies, maybe soccer, video games, or music. But in 1936, the government made a law that said all young people had to join the Hitler Youth. It wasn't a club you could quit. It was mandatory. By 1939, over 8 million kids were members. If parents tried to stop their kids from joining, the parents could go to prison. The organization took up all their free time. They went camping and played sports, but they also learned how to march and how to shoot. They were being brainwashed to love the leader above their own families. They were taught to spy on their parents and report them if they said anything against the government. It turned children against their own homes. Today, recruiting children into armed groups or political indoctrination is illegal under international laws regarding child soldiers. Kids have a right to a childhood, but back then, the state owned the youth. They wanted to ensure that the next generation would follow orders without question. It stole the innocence of millions of kids, and while they were taking the children, they were also taking the family fortune. 14. Legal theft of property. Imagine working your whole life to buy a house or build a business. Then one day, the government says you have to sell it for pennies. This was called Aryanization. It was a fancy word for theft. Jewish business owners were forced to sell their companies to non-Jewish people for a fraction of what they were worth. It was all legal. The laws made it impossible for Jewish people to own businesses. They had to sign over their factories, their shops, and even their art. The money they did get was often put into blocked accounts that they could not access. It was a massive transfer of wealth. The government basically looted an entire group of people. Today, there are still court cases going on where families are trying to get back art or property that was stolen during this time. We have laws now that demand restitution. You cannot just take someone's property because of who they are. But in the 30s, it was government policy. It left families destitute and desperate. It was economic violence designed to destroy them. And as they lost their money, they also had to deal with insults that were perfectly legal. 15. Insulting people in public. We have laws today about harassment. If you follow someone around screaming insults at them, the police will stop you. But under the regime, public insults based on ethnicity were not just allowed. They were funny to the people in charge. There were signs on park benches that said certain people couldn't sit there. There were signs at the entrance of towns that said unwanted people should keep moving. It was a constant stream of verbal abuse. If someone spit on a Jewish person in the street, the police would look the other way. It stripped people of their dignity. It made them feel less than human. Today, hate speech laws in the European Union and many other places make this illegal. You cannot target people with abuse in public spaces. Every person has a right to walk down the street without being harassed. But the goal back then was to make life so miserable that people would leave. It was psychological warfare waged by the citizens against their neighbors. And if you didn't like it, you couldn't even vote for someone else to fix it. 16. Banning all other parties. In a democracy, you have choices. You can vote for the blue team, the red team, or the green team. If you don't like the leader, you vote them out. But in July of 1933, the government passed a law that made the Nazi Party the only legal political party in Germany. They banned the Social Democrats, the Communists, and everyone else. If you tried to start a new party, you went to prison. It became a one-party state. There were no more debates. There were no more elections that mattered. The leader had total control. Today, banning opposition parties is unconstitutional in democratic nations. We value political pluralism. We need different voices to make a society work. But the regime saw different voices as a threat. They wanted total obedience. This ensured that no one could legally challenge their power. They changed the laws so that the laws could never be changed back. It was the death of democracy. And with total power, they felt they could do anything, even to the human body in freezing conditions. 17. The freezing tests. We mentioned the cold water experiments earlier, but it is important to understand the scale. At the camp in Dachau, they had special basins built just for this. They would put people in suits or leave them naked and submerge them for hours. They measured their heart rates as they slowly froze. They wanted to know exactly when death occurred. They tried different ways to warm them up, some of which were just as painful as the freezing. They used boiling water. They used lamps. They treated humans like broken machinery that needed to be jump-started. The cruelty is hard to comprehend. These were innocent people. Today, this kind of torture is a war crime. The doctors who did this were put on trial later, but while they were doing it, they wrote papers and gave speeches about their great findings. It shows how science without ethics becomes a monster. They lost sight of the fact that they were dealing with living, breathing people. And they didn't just use cold, they used disease too. 18. Injecting diseases. Most medical research is about curing diseases. But at the camps in Buchenwald and Natzweiler, they were injecting healthy people with deadly illnesses. They injected them with typhus and malaria. They wanted to see how the diseases progressed, and they wanted to test vaccines. But they weren't testing vaccines to save the patients. They were testing them to see if they worked for the soldiers. The prisoners were just vessels for the sickness. Hundreds of people perished in agony from high fevers and organ failure. They kept meticulous records. They had charts showing the fever spikes. It was a cold, clinical observation of suffering. Today, biological experimentation on non-consenting humans is strictly banned. We have strict ethical review boards for any medical study. But back then, the camp doctors had absolute power. They could do whatever they wanted, and no one could stop them. It was a betrayal of the medical oath to do no harm. And while these physical attacks were happening, there was a mental attack happening through the airwaves. 19. The radio that only played one song. Well, not literally one song, but one message. The government produced a cheap radio called the People's Receiver. It was designed so that every German family could afford one. But there was a catch. It had a limited range. It could not pick up foreign stations like the BBC from England. It could only pick up German stations. This meant the government controlled exactly what news and information people received in their living rooms. They listened to speeches by the leader and news reports that were completely fabricated. It created an echo chamber. People thought the whole world agreed with Germany because that is all they heard. Listening to foreign radio stations eventually became a crime punishable by death. They called it broadcasting crimes. Today, access to information is a human right. Censoring the internet or jamming radio signals is what dictatorships do. But back then, the radio was the most powerful weapon they had to control, the minds of the people. It made sure everyone stayed in line. And finally, the legal system itself was twisted to serve the party. 20. The People's Court. In a normal court, you have a lawyer, and the judge is supposed to be neutral. But the regime created the People's Court to handle political offenses. These trials were a sham. The judges shouted at the defendants. The lawyers were often too scared to say anything. There was a famous judge named Roland Freisler who would scream at people on trial, calling them traitors. The verdicts were decided before the trial even started. People were sentenced to death for handing out flyers or telling jokes about the government. It was a mockery of justice. There was no appeal. If the People's Court said you were guilty, that was it. Today, the right to a fair trial is the cornerstone of justice. Judges must be impartial, but this court was just a tool to remove anyone who disagreed. It shows that just because something is legal doesn't mean it is right. The laws in Nazi Germany allowed for all these terrible things. It is a reminder that we always have to watch out for our rights and protect the vulnerable, so that history never repeats itself.